Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. So a few months ago, I had created a series on versus characters where I basically took two comic book characters from Marvel and DC and I pit them against one another to see who would win. And it really seemed to be popular with you guys. A lot of you guys really seemed to like it. But at the time, my channel was kind of going through waxes and wanes, and so I had to sort of vacate it for a time. But I wanted to bring it back. But I figure if I'm going to do that, what better way to kick that off, at least to test the waters and see if there's still interest in it, than to do the DC versus Marvel crossover. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Marvel and DC had crossovers for quite some time, and it really just started out with an experiment with Superman and Spider-Man. But it proved to be wildly successful, and Marvel and DC did this with their most popular characters. There was a Punisher, Batman crossover, so on and so forth. With the 1990s, the comic book industry was on the verge of collapse, just because you had the speculator boom, you had the great, comic bubble of the 1990s, and I've got a great big series on that in my Valiant Comics videos that you guys are welcome to check out. You'll find that video down in the description. But the result was that Marvel and DC decided to pull out all the stops in 1995 and 1996 and basically bring these crossovers to a head and have a company-wide crossover. And so what this does is it splits. It basically takes the 11 best heroes from Marvel and from DC, and it puts them against one another to see who will win. But the way that this was done is half of the fights were basically determined, or I guess 6 of the fights were determined by the publishers, and the other fights were determined by fans. And so what we do as we get into this is we initially pick up with Spider-Man. Now, something to point out here is this Spider-Man is not Peter Parker. This Spider-Man is actually Ben Reilly. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Ben Reilly was the second clone of Spider-Man created by the Jackal Miles Warren. And the idea was to basically subvert Spider-Man's legacy. The original clone, or I guess the first one, was Kane, but this all sort of led into the clone saga where the question was, is Peter Parker a clone? Is Ben Reilly, or is Kane the actual Spider-Man? Yeah, the actual Peter Parker? Like, how does this whole thing tie into itself? And actually, Clone Saga, in a lot of ways, drove people away from comics. But the result was that, Ben Reilly had kind of become a mainstay in Marvel Comics at the time. And so because of this, while Peter Parker had basically vacated his position as Spider-Man in order to basically raise his child alongside Mary Jane Watson, Ben Reilly had taken up the role of Spider-Man in his stead. And there's some distinctions here in terms of their costumes, so that we as readers can tell the differences between the two. But what this story does is it shows Ben Reilly going about, New York and just doing his normal thing, where he's just patrolling the streets, so on and so forth. But he eventually comes across an alleyway where he's pulled into a dimensional rift. And the result is that he's yanked into Gotham City and he encounters the Joker. Now, this is the funny thing about this, because the Joker has met Spider-Man before. There was a Spider-Man Batman crossover when they went against the Joker and Carnage, I believe. And the result was that, of course, Spider-Man and Batman won. But for the Joker, he remembers Spider-Man. The issue here is that because this is not Peter Parker, Ben Reilly doesn't know who the Joker is. And so Ben Reilly's really trying to gain his bearings around here. And because he doesn't know how dangerous the Joker is, he doesn't really provoke him. He's just kind of like, what's going on here? Who are you? That kind of thing. He's really more curious about a situation than he is anything else. And the Joker's kind of laughs things off here. And so the Joker basically just bails out and gives Ben Reilly his signature card. Now, from here, we transition to the X-Men. And the X-Men are basically battling, the Juggernaut, which this isn't designed to be anything significant. This is simply just designed to show us what the X-Men were doing at the time. And because the Juggernaut was really one of their most formidable foes, being the brother of Charles Xavier, it makes sense that Marvel and DC would show us battling, or show the X-Men battling Juggernaut. But in the midst of their conflict, Kane Marco basically vanishes. He disappears. And when he reemerges, he's in Metropolis and he comes face to face with Superman. Now, what it is that happens between the two of them is not something that we immediately see. Instead, we actually pick up with a new creation, a character who's named Access. And now, Access is an interesting scenario here because he was created in this story. He had never existed in either Marvel or DC. And we're actually going to learn there's a little more about him than is initially given to us. But he was basically the homeless guy who was sitting alongside this cardboard box when Ben Reilly was pulled into it and ended up in Gotham City. And the indication here from Access is, for some reason, these universes are starting to, people are crossing over between these two realities. And it seems as though this has happened before and it's continuing to happen even though it shouldn't. Now, again, this is left very mysterious here. This is left, very confusing to us. And so what we do is we switch over to Captain America in New York. And Captain America America is basically just fighting bad guys, because again, these sections of the story whereby we're seeing what the characters are doing when they're being yanked in are just designed to show us what the characters are doing. And with Captain America, he's just fighting bad guys. He's just doing his own thing. But again, he vanishes. And so what DC and Marvel do is, instead of giving us these long drawn explanations on what characters are getting into at the time, instead they play it very fast and they play it very loose, in the sense that Wonder Woman is in the midst of saving, people's lives while there's a bridge collapsing, and then suddenly she vanishes. We pick up with the Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk Bruce Banner is spending time with Betty Ross and he vanishes. Now, the Incredible Hulk is actually an interesting situation here. And the reason why I say that is because this is not Savage Hulk. This is actually, it's basically Professor Hulk. This is an instance whereby the Incredible Hulk has the mind of Bruce Banner, but does not have his full unbridled strength. Now, this is something that I want you to keep in mind, because when it comes to the Incredible Hulk Superman conflict, we're actually going to see things turn out an interesting way, and it's going to be one of the reasons why there's so much debate on the Incredible Hulk versus Superman idea. But from here, we switch to Connor Kent. Now, with Superboy, this is again, after the death and return of Superman. And so for those of you guys who don't know about that story, it was basically DC trying to find a way to make Superman relevant, and the most logical way to do it seemed to be to kill him off and then bring him back. But while he was gone, DC launched a story called Reign of the Supermen, where we got the Eradicator, we got Cyborg, we got John Henry Iron Steel, and we got Superboy. This is basically the continuation of his story, just because he was so wildly popular when he first showed up. He was your quintessential 1990s superhero. He had the leather jacket, he had the sunglasses, the whole 9 yards, and fans absolutely loved him. And so because of that, he stuck around. And so again, just like everybody else, he gets yanked into another universe. He gets yanked into a different reality. And so we end up switching over to Lobo in Deep Space. And again, Lobo's just doing his thing where he's just ripping stuff up and he gets yanked as well. And this is basically the pattern that happens with every single person. While the X-Men are trying to figure out what happened with Kane Marco, while they're trying to figure out where it was that he was teleported to, we end up seeing that Wolverine, that Gambit, and Storm are teleported away. Kyle Rayner, Elektra, Thor, the Flash Wally West, Aquaman, Silver Surfer, Shazam, Name of the Submariner, Quicksilver, Catwoman, all these characters are just teleported away. And so what this does is it allows us to basically jump forward. This is Marvel and DC effectively telling us there are a lot of characters that have been pulled in. And so for us as the reader, we're going to find that there are actually some characters that we haven't seen get pulled in that have been forced to switch realities. And the first of these comes in the form of Bullseye. Now, Bullseye is well known to be a Daredevil villain. He really achieved the height of his popularity during Frank Miller's run when he killed Elektra, but he has been teleported to the Batcave. And of course, because he's a villain, the first thing he does is he immediately takes Robin hostage. Now, because Robin has received such prodigious training at the hands of Batman, Robin's easily able to counter Bullseye. The problem here is that because Bullseye's accuracy is so precise, when Batman throws his Batarang, Bullseye is able to dodge it. The great thing here, though, is that this is basically an illusion. This is more or less a trick, and Batman immediately goes in for the attack and incapacitates Bullseye. Now, the funny thing about this is Bullseye makes a couple comments, one of them saying that Batman hits harder than Daredevil. And this is really the height, this is really the purpose of the DC versus Marvel crossover. This is purely a fan-driven story and is played fast and loose. And what I mean by that is whenever you see crossover events taking place between publishers, or you see crossover events taking place within a single publisher, Marvel, DC, Valiant, Image, so on and so forth, they usually give us exposition. They give us a lot of time to absorb everything that's going on, and they usually played in a situation to where everything is given context. Explanations are usually given to everything in order for it to make sense. The issue here is that in the DC versus Marvel crossover, this doesn't happen. And so with, Batman and Tim Drake subduing Bullseye, Tim Drake's immediately teleported away, and we don't really know why. But what we do know is that he's teleported away into the bed of Jubilee in the Marvel universe. And so this is effectively how things work. Now, the second iteration of this comes in the form of the Daily Planet and J. Jonah Jameson. Now, as we know, J. Jonah Jameson he's the Daily Bugle guy in Marvel Comics. But when he appears in the Daily Planet, he basically just takes over the position of editor-in-chief. We're not told how he does this, and we're not told why. He simply just is. He's simply just the guy who's running the show now. And again, this is just an example of them playing everything fast and loose. This is just an example of them playing everything, without a whole lot of exposition here. And so at this point, it's basically just a scenario of Marvel characters versus DC characters. And the question is, what's what's going on here. We initially pick up with the Absorbing Man going against John Henry Iron Steel. Now, this is actually a pretty formidable fight because, you know, Crusher Creel can basically turn his body into a material so long as he touches it. And so going against John Henry Irons, going against Steel, if he touches, you know, John Henry Irons' uniform, he'll make his body into that material. And so from here, we jump to Kyle Rayner. Kyle Rayner is going against the Green Goblin. Captain America is battling Bane. And of course, Daredevil is going against the Riddler. We also have Batman, who's dealing with Venom. We have Shazam, who's dealing with Doctor Doom. The Punisher dealing with Deathstroke, as well as Martian Manhunter and Firestorm going against Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm. And this is the pattern that just keeps repeating itself. And this is why this story was so huge, because it's a dream scenario. What happens when our favorite characters, the most popular characters from Marvel and DC, basically end up fighting one another? Now, again, a lot of answers aren't being given here. Of course, you know, Superman playing the role of Clark Kent is asking the question to, you know, both himself and anybody who happens to see the situation, what's going on? Does anybody have any idea what's happening? And so what we do as we pick up with the end of this first issue is we basically follow the Spectre. And what we find out with the Spectre is that, you know, he, alongside the Living Tribunal in Marvel Comics, are also trying to understand everything that's going on. But from their perspectives, because the Living Tribunal is second in command to the one above all, to basically God in the Marvel Universe, and because the Spectre is an agent of God, the Judeo-Christian God in DC Comics, the fact that they don't know what's going on is a huge deal. All they really know is that things are changing. But from both of their perceptions, they also come to the realization that there are these two godly beings that have never been seen before. And both of these beings represent, or I guess one of them represents Marvel, the other represents DC, and they seem to be bridging the gap between one another in the sense that they're responsible for the reason for why these heroes are crossing over with one another. So as we continue into part 2 of DC versus Marvel, this is where we begin to transition away from our discussion on heroes and villains from the DC universe who have been transported to Marvel and those from Marvel who have been transported to DC, and we start getting into battles between the most prominent characters from both DC and Marvel. But the first thing we get here is a little bit of explanation. Now, I'm actually taking this out of continuity in the story because this is given to us later in the story, but I think that at the beginning is a really good place to put this. What we're told is that, unbeknownst to us as the reader, at the beginning of all things, there were basically two brothers. One brother represented the DC universe and one brother represented the Marvel universe. And the result was that while they were relatively aware of the other's existence, they simply chose to ignore each other. The problem is that because they were two halves of a whole, each one desired to be unique and to be whole in and of himself. The only way for them to do this, or seem to be able to do this, was to basically battle one another, and the loser would have their universe wiped out. And so that's exactly what they've done. They've basically created kind of a battleground using the characters of the Marvel and the DC universe, and they've chosen to pit them against one another, and whoever loses basically loses their reality. Now, one distinction to make here is that this is not a battle to the death. This is simply an instance of proving who's superior. So all that's really necessary is for one hero to knock out the other in order to gain the victory. So, you know, Thor doesn't have to kill Shazam. He just has to overpower and knock him out. And so you're going to see that in the story. You're not really going to see, you know, characters killing each other. You're going to see characters knocking each other out. Now, the reason behind this is something that I'm not 100% sure of, because finding interviews from writers, you know, from Peter David or Ron Marz, who wrote this story, it is difficult at best. And so there really isn't a definitive explanation coming from either publisher on why this decision was made. But if I had to hazard a guess, I would say because this was targeted towards kids. And, you know, even though the Comics Code Authority wasn't really in existence, even though there weren't really rules on the kind of content that comics could display in terms of violence, there was still just sort of a social contract. There was just a measure of decorum. You couldn't have characters just killing each other arbitrarily. Not only that, it was difficult for fans to make a distinguished difference between what's in continuity and what's out of continuity. And so if in this story Wolverine had died and then he showed up in the Marvel Universe, prospective readers would have been like, well, what happened? Why is Wolverine not dead? I thought he died in Marvel versus DC. And so, you know, for that reason, again, I'm just kind of speculating here. I'm just sort of spitballing with you guys. In truth, your answer is as good as mine. But after this exposition is given to us, we basically pick up with Wolverine and Killer Croc battling one another. Now, this is really just, again, another situation of these characters just fighting. just these characters battling. This is just, again, showing us that Marvel and DC, the switch that's taking place, is requiring these heroes to cope with their their own situations. From here, we actually end up jumping to Thanos. And Thanos is again just monitoring the fluctuations of the universe itself. Now, what we're told is that Thanos is actually sort of happy about what's happening here. And the reason why is because, again, this is a point in Thanos' history where he's constantly trying to appease Mistress Death, and he's constantly trying to end life as best he can in order to make Mistress Death as happy as he can. And so to see the universe fluctuating presents two scenarios. One, it presents the ability for him to rise to power by capitalizing on the confusion that everyone's experiencing, and two, it allows him to use whatever these fluctuations are for the purpose of just destroying the universe and everybody in it, which again would go towards making Mistress Death happy. The problem is that while Thanos is analyzing this, Darkseid shows up when a boom tube opens up. Now, we don't immediately find out what happens between these two, but I will say that later on down the line, the Infinity Gauntlet gets involved, which is, it's both really cool, but it's a huge letdown at the same time. But from here, we jump to Captain America and Bane. Now, the Captain America and Bane section is again just a segment of the comic, just a segment of the battle between the two. This is designed to show us that the two of them are simply just going at it. They're still fighting one another, and that's basically what this is. It just gives us small little highlights, here and there between these two characters. We switch to, I guess we switch back to Wolverine and and Killer Croc going against one another. And as the two of them are battling, they're basically being watched by Dick Grayson. Dick Grayson is watching this entire series of events unfold, and from his perspective, as Nightwing at this point in time, watching over Bloodhaven, he's just kind of like, okay, this is pretty wild, but it seems as though even if Killer Croc is a bad guy, if this dude with adamantium claws, or I guess from Dick Grayson's perspective, metal claws, is tearing through Killer Croc, it may be this guy is worse than Killer Croc. But what we also know is that while Dick Grayson is watching these events unfold, that Gambit is sneaking up behind him. And so from here, we switch to Storm and we switch to Wonder Woman, and it's simply just the two of them encountering each other for the first time. Now, what we end up doing is we actually switch back to Captain America and Bane, and this shows us our first victory of the story so far. One interesting thing that happens with DC versus Marvel, and something that we'll see a lot, is we'll see heroes being defeated, or individuals attempting to defeat heroes using moves that they were most prominently known for. For example, with Bane, he tries to break the back of Captain America in the same way that he broke the back of Bruce Wayne. But there's huge differences here. Captain America's no pushover. Granted, Bruce Wayne is not a pushover, but Bruce Wayne doesn't have super strength. Captain America does. And this is exactly what happens. He immediately overpowers Bane while he tries to break his back, and he simply just knocks him out when he throws his shield, and it comes back and it hits Bane in the back of the head. Now, again, this is just another example of how Marvel and DC are playing the story fast and loose. We just kind of have to assume that the shield was thrown. We know that Captain America recalls his shield whenever it's thrown, and that's it. That's all we get. He just knocked out Bane with his own shield. I know a lot of you guys would probably want a little more in terms of explanation. I know you guys would probably want a little more in terms of, well, how does this all work? It's not designed to be that way. This story is designed to be just action. It's a fan-based story. And so what happens is we switch to Bruce Wayne, and at this point, Batman is basically watching, the Lizard, Doc Connors, analyzing this skyscraper, trying to get a grip of his situation. But while this happens, Dick Grayson is taken by surprise from Gambit. And so the result is that, Bruce Wayne basically sides with Dick Grayson and ends up going to save him instead of keeping an eye on Doc Connors. But what we learn is that while this is happening, while they're distracted with what's going on, while Bruce Wayne is checking on Dick Grayson to make sure he's okay, Gambit and Wolverine steal the Batmobile. And again, the question we would ask as readers is, how did they get past the defenses? Surely the Batmobile has defenses to keep anybody from, anybody except for those approved by Bruce Wayne from using it, but somehow he was able to take it and he was able to use it. And in the end, it doesn't matter because again, this is all just fan service. This is all just what happens in this crazy situation. And so with Gambit and Wolverine taking off, the question is, with this vehicle being as powerful as it is, being as fast as it is, maybe they can get back to Westchester, maybe they can get back to Charles Xavier, and they can find out everything that's going on. Instead, we basically end up switching over to a combination of different things. What happens is we basically pick up with Jubilee and Tim Drake talking to one another. We pick up with, this explanation from Access, basically telling us that this dimension, this wall, this barrier that's supposed to exist between the Marvel and DC universes is becoming weaker and weaker. And the result is that because these brothers have noticed each other, because of the fact that these brothers are now fighting one another, that in the end, it's basically collapsing everything around them, and all these heroes are going to have to fight. And this is essentially just Access, you know, becoming aware of the entire battleground that these brothers have made for the Marvel and DC characters to fight one another. But from here, we basically switch over to Thor and Shazam. Now, this was actually a really interesting scenario to me. And the reason why I say this is, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Shazam, he is a character who derives his power from the Greek gods, so to speak. You know, he's got the strength of Hercules and you know, so on and so forth. The idea is that Thor represents the other half of this equation. Thor is, you know, the son of Odin. And so it's like seeing these two European gods battling one another based off European mythology. And there's a kind of respect that exists between the two of them. You know, they're simply not just fighting one another arbitrarily. Instead, because they are so powerful, they actually take time to pray, you know, before they actually engage in a conflict. And so while they're doing that, we basically switch back over to Thanos and Darkseid. In my mind, these two were probably the most anticipated battle of the entire conflict, because in the eyes of fans, Thanos and, you know, Darkseid are effectively the same character in two different variations. And this is how it exists for a lot of this conflict. You know, Deadpool is basically, you know, Marvel's version of Deathstroke. Lobo is DC's version of Wolverine. You know, the characters are all influenced by each other. You know, they're designed for different reasons, but in a lot of ways, Marvel's copied DC, DC's copied Marvel. And that's one of the reasons why this series was so derisive and why so many fans read it, because fans of characters wanted to see their characters win. And if their characters didn't win, they would get angry. And that's one of the reasons why Marvel and DC actually allowed fans to vote on the outcome of some of these conflicts. But instead of initially battling one another, Thanos and Darkseid actually take wagers on who would win, you know, on who would come out on top if the two of them were to fight each other. And so from here, we switch back to Thor and to Shazam. And the two of them were engaging in a pretty, you know, extreme battle against one another, a pretty monstrous battle. And with Thor and Shazam, we would expect it to be that way, just because of the fact that with his hammer, with Mjolnir, Thor is a force to be reckoned with. But Shazam is no pushover. Shazam is effectively as powerful as Superman, depending on the circumstances. And so it was really just kind of a toss-up to see who would come out on top here. The result is that while they're in the middle of fighting at a you know, at a carnival, and when the Ferris wheel collapses onto Shazam, he ends up shouting the word Shazam, which turns him back into Billy Batson. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Shazam, he was created after Superman in the 1940s, but he proved to be more popular than Superman in the 1940s, and it was actually because of a lawsuit from DC that Shazam disappeared for, you know, 20 years. And by the time he reemerged, you know, while he was originally called Captain Marvel, Marvel Comics already trademarked Captain Marvel with their own character, and so DC started calling him Shazam. But whenever it is that Billy Batson, the teenager, yells the word Shazam, he's bestowed with his powers and he becomes the superhero. But there's pluses, you know, there's benefits and drawbacks to this. You know, the first is that if he shouts Shazam as Captain Marvel, in this situation, he'll turn back into Billy Batson, which allows him to get out of tight situations. And this is exactly what happens. With the Ferris wheel collapsing on him, he shouts Shazam, he turns back into Billy Batson, and he gets his way out. The issue to this is that if he were to shout Shazam again, he would turn back into Captain Marvel. But all somebody has to do is stop him from doing that. And so the result is Thor does this. Thor basically takes away Billy Batson's ability to say his name again, and he seems to effectively be knocked unconscious. The issue here is that his hammer, you know, Thor's hammer is knocked out of his hand, and when that happens, Wonder Woman happens along and sees the hammer. And when she goes to pick it up, it seems as though she's going to be successful in lifting the hammer of Thor. But before we find out, we switch to a conflict between Namor and Aquaman. Now, this is a trend that I hope you guys are noticing. Marvel and DC are basically giving us situations where characters who are almost identical in nature are fighting one another. Namor and Aquaman are basically it. You know, they are two halves of the same coin. You know, of course, Namor was actually around before Aquaman, but the fact remains that each have their own legacies and their own histories in their own right, but they both hail from the sea. They're both kings of their own dominions undersea, and, you know, they're both kings of Atlantis. And so the result is that while those two are initially going against one another, we end up switching over to the Flash, to Wally West, and to Quicksilver. Now, this is one of those instances where the question is asked, who's faster? the Flash or Quicksilver. Now, at this point in time in Marvel and DC Comics, this was a legitimate question because there were instances where Quicksilver was extremely fast, wildly fast. And because they had never met, because they had never crossed over, there was always this question being raised. Now, at this moment right now with like DC Rebirth and New 52, so on and so forth, we know Barry Allen is much faster than Quicksilver. We know Wally West is much faster than Quicksilver. In Final Crisis, Barry Allen outran death. You know, Quicksilver's never done that. This also took place before the storyline when Wally West outran the universe. And so this was a legitimate question back then as to which one is faster. And of course, the guns are really stuck to here in the sense that despite Quicksilver being as fast as he is, he's simply no match for Wally West. Wally West is just way too fast in terms of his speed, and he easily dominates, Quicksilver. He takes him over pretty fast. It's really not a huge contest here. And so what we end up doing is we switch back to Aquaman and to Namor the Submariner. And initially the conflict seems pretty even between the two of them. You know, the conflict seems pretty straightforward. The issue here is that Aquaman possesses an ability that Namor does not. Namor, is King of Atlantis. He does have super strength. You know, he is a human Atlantean hybrid, but Aquaman has the ability to communicate with sea life. Now, that's kind of where I'm going to leave it because I know it's a very touchy subject when Aquaman fans hear people say that, because Aquaman fans, routinely say he doesn't talk to fish. Whether or not he talks to fish is irrelevant here. The fact is that he basically communicates, however it is that he does it, with an orca whale, and the orca lands on top of Namor the Submariner and seems to incapacitate him. And so from here, we basically switch over to the end of the comic. And what the end of the comic does is it reveals a few things. The first is that we are going to see Thanos and Darkseid fight one another. But the second and the most important thing is that Wonder Woman is successful in lifting the hammer of Thor. And this is a huge deal because she's actually the first character that we've ever seen outside of Marvel Comics to lift Thor's hammer, something that a lot of us didn't actually think that she'd be capable of. But in any event, again, like the last video, post a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about this one so far. I'm kind of curious. And yeah, this series was really fun. The issue is, I'm kind of a stickler for explanations, and I'm a stickler for exposition. And this story is more action than anything else. And so it's it's kind of hard to explain a lot of the things that are going on behind the scenes. But so as we pick up with part 3 of DC versus Marvel, this is when we start to get into the idea that not everything is crazy battle high octane. Instead, we actually pick up with Jubilee and Tim Drake. Now, the funny thing about this is when Tim Drake was teleported to the room of Jubilee, they had begun talking with one another, and Jubilee had actually sort of fallen in love, even though it was a very, very short amount of time. Jubilee had always tried to find, Mr. Right, so to speak. Despite being a teenager, being a young girl, she was always a reflection of the teenage readers who were going through Marvel Comics at the time, which is one of the reasons why she was so popular. This was compounded with the fact that in the cartoon show X-Men the Animated Series, she was us as the reader in this universe of X-Men. She reflected us, the fans who were running around in this reality where things were absolutely insane. But after being teleported to a strange warehouse of sorts, both Jubilee and Tim Drake are forced to do battle against one another. And so, of course, again, because this is not a battle to the death, their goal isn't to kill each other. Their goal is to just defeat one another. And so this is basically what happens while they're going through. Jubilee's using her little fireworks and so on and so forth. But with Tim Drake, he's received such prodigious training from Batman that he knows how to evade individuals who do have powers. And this is what he does. He starts dodging Jubilee. He basically avoids her eye contact and he runs away. And her initial thought is simply trying to locate him, but it's difficult to do because he keeps hiding in the shadows. Now, eventually, she stumbles upon his cape, but when she goes to it, she realizes it's a trap, and Tim Drake comes up behind her, throws his lasso around her, and basically ensnares her. And so again, this is a little bit of romance here. This is just a little bit of showing us that things aren't terrible, that sometimes, good things come out of situations like this. And so while the two share a little bit of romantic banter between themselves, and, of course, while Tim Drake goes to let her go, we end up transitioning to space, and we pick up with Kyle Rayner, the Green Lantern, and Silver Surfer. Now, for those of you guys who are current Green Lantern readers, this may be something that you guys will really have been anticipating, because a battle between the Green Lantern and Silver Surfer is on par with the Incredible Hulk versus Superman, which is actually a conflict we'll see in this story, you know, between Batman and Black Panther or Punisher or somebody like that. It just seems to make sense. You know, it's just two similar characters. Green Lanterns deal with space, the Silver Surfer deals with space. It'd be interesting to see the battle between them, between each other. Now, the one thing to also take note of here is that these two, Silver Surfer and Green Lantern, have met before. There was actually a story called Unholy Alliances that dealt with Hal Jordan, who was still operating under the mantle of Parallax, as the main enemy, and both Hal Rayner and Silver Surfer joining forces to defeat Hal Jordan. The issue here is what Silver Surfer says is that the powers of these brothers, who are basically kind of screwing with reality, are well beyond even those of Galactus. And so because the Silver Surfer, you know, is a herald of Galactus, and because he's used to such incredible power, the fact that these brothers have power that goes well beyond Galactus means that they're not to be trifled with. And so Silver Surfer and Green Lantern are kind of in a situation, from Surfer's perspective anyway, that they cannot avoid this conflict. And so this is really where Kyle Rayner's popularity came into play. And for those of you guys who don't know, you know, Hal Jordan's comics just weren't selling, you know, in the really the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. For decades, they were just not selling, and try as they might, DC could not make him popular. And so what they did is they chose to write him out with the story Emerald Twilight, and they replaced him with Kyle Rayner. And Kyle Rayner was a lot more popular because he was an artist, and he would use his Green Lantern ring to make all kinds of crazy things like what you're seeing here, you know, where he has a giant horse and he has armor and so on and so forth, you know, whereas Hal Jordan would use his ring to make like giant hands and fists and different things like that. The result is that the two of them, you know, Silver Surfer and Kyle Rayner, basically charge at one another in something that's a little bit anticlimactic, and it results in this massive explosion, and Silver Surfer is completely unfazed, or seems to be completely unfazed. And so this is basically Marvel and DC telling us that the Silver Surfer is more powerful than Kyle Rayner. Now, something that I also want to address here is Kyle Rayner, the White Lantern, as it exists right now. If Silver Surfer were to go against Kyle Rayner as the White Lantern, it would be no contest. Silver Surfer would probably be obliterated. But, you know, again, this is just another example of sort of inspiring debate. So I'm curious, leave a comment down below in terms of who you think would win, the Silver Surfer or the White Lantern, Kyle Rayner. I have a feeling a lot of responses will be White Lantern, Kyle Rayner, but what we do here is we switch over to Selina Kyle and Elektra. Now, this is one of the interesting situations, you know, with this story, because these are characters who are both villains, but they could not be any more opposite. And what I mean by that is, while, you know, Selina Kyle is very formidable in terms of her fighting abilities, she's not an assassin, but Elektra is. Elektra is a prodigious assassin, probably the best assassin in the world. And the result is that she's ruthless. She has no real qualms with killing people. And this is the point that she makes to Selina Kyle. You know, while the two of them are fighting one another, you know, Elektra is, at least originally, it seems to be bound by Selina and her whips. But Elektra turns the tables, and she basically hangs Selina Kyle off the edge, you know, with Selina Kyle hanging onto her whip. And then Elektra says, as an assassin, she has her own code of conduct. She has her own moral compass that she follows. She's only willing to kill those that she agrees to kill. But she's basically been forced into this situation, and she says that she will not kill Selina Kyle, but she still wants to win. And so the result is that she severs the rope. Selina Kyle collapses down, you know, falls into this giant thing of sand, and she basically falls unconscious, meaning that Elektra is now the victor in this situation. And so because the Daily Planet, you know, of course, is again under the control of J. Jonah Jameson, and it exists to sell itself, is basically keeping track of everything that's happened so far. And so what we know is that between the heroes and the villains from Marvel and DC who've been fighting one another, so far the battle is 3-3. It's deadlocked. You know, it's completely even. And we pick up with Lois Lane and Ben Reilly operating as Peter Parker. And what happens here is actually kind of funny. You know, Ben Reilly had previously rescued, you know, Lois Lane from the clutches of the Scarecrow, you know, and had kind of become smitten with her, you know, had sort of developed an attraction towards her. And he actually hits on her. He actually asks her, you know, if she wants to go get dinner sometime, and she says that she's engaged. And then of course, Superman immediately pops up. You know, Clark Kent shows up and says that he's the one that she's engaged to. And Ben Reilly just kind of takes off. You know, he's extremely embarrassed about the situation. You know, he's extremely embarrassed about what it was that happened. But what we also do is we switch back to the character of Access. Now, I know we haven't had a lot of explanation on him, and there's a reason for that. You know, the reason is I actually wanted to wait until this video to do that. What we're told is that, you know, Access is yet another in a long line of gatekeepers, is the best way to explain it. You know, in this story, what Marvel and DC establish is that there is effectively kind of like a barrier, a dimensional wall between the Marvel and the DC universes. And the role of, you know, this kid Axel, who's going by the name Access, and those that came before him, specifically the homeless man who's basically his mentor, has been to always be the gatekeeper, to always ensure that these universes never crossed over. And that's one of the reasons why characters cross over occasionally, because sometimes, it would happen without Access knowing that it happened, and then they would go back to their respective universes and that breach would be sealed. The result is that Access is kind of like this shard of both realities merged into a singular being, which explains why he's capable of jumping back and forth between the Marvel and the DC universes, which is actually something that we'll see come into play later on. But in truth, he's really just a plot device. He's really just a way for Marvel and DC to kind of give themselves an out when it comes to the end of the story, something that we'll see they're in desperate need of, by the time it's all said and done. But we end up switching, out in space, and we pick up with Wolverine and we pick up with Lobo. Now, one thing I also want to point out here is that these characters are being teleported. Wolverine's being teleported by the brothers to the realm of Lobo. He's not simply just getting in a vehicle and taking off into space, but again, because this is being played so fast and loose, even if that wasn't the case, we would just kind of have to accept that Wolverine is in space right now fighting Lobo. But one of the big downsides here is that a majority of this conflict actually takes place off panel. With Wolverine having a healing factor and having adamantium claws, adamantium is the strongest metal in existence. And what Marvel and DC seem to be saying here is that it's the strongest metal in existence, whether it's Marvel or DC. And that's exactly what happens. He basically takes the fight, of course, with his healing factor. He's able to deal with the blows of Lobo, and they start fighting each other behind a bar. And the result is we don't see a lot of what happens. We don't really see who it is, how Lobo's defeated. All we know is that Wolverine is the person who comes out on top smoking a cigar. And this isn't really designed to be a serious thing, because of the fact that Wolverine was so over the top and crazy in terms of his character development. DC responded by creating Lobo, who was designed to be over the top and crazy, designed to be a parody basically of Wolverine. And so this is just kind of really designed to be a comedic thing. To be honest, it's designed to show just two ridiculously over the top characters fighting against one another. But at this point, we jump back to Wonder Woman. And again, in the last video, we had talked about how Wonder Woman had discovered the hammer of Thor, and she succeeded in picking it up. And when she did, it made her, Wonder Woman with all the powers of Thor. It changed her outfit, the whole 9 yards. But for her, because she's going to be fighting Storm, and because Wonder Woman is a woman of honor, having the hammer would destroy any chance that Storm has of being successful. And so Wonder Woman actually drops it. She abandons the power of Thor and just decides to fight, Storm one-on-one, mano a mano. The problem with this is that despite her vaunted strength, despite her, her ability to fly and so on and so forth, Storm controls the elements. And that's the one thing that Wonder Woman seems powerless against. And that's exactly what happens. Storm starts calling down the power of electricity, and she just keeps shocking, Wonder Woman over and over again. But what also happens here is Storm begins to develop a respect for Wonder Woman. Now, it's not to say they didn't have a respect for each other before, but with Storm, because she is, such a strong female character, it's kind of extending that. With Wonder Woman being from Themyscira, because she's raised or was raised in a society where it was predominantly women, and it was women those women having a sort of a code of honor among themselves, it extends to both Storm and Wonder Woman herself. And so Storm sees her very much not as really a biological sister, but as, a sister on a very personal level, in the sense that they formed a kind of bond here, that they have respect for one another. And so in the end, Storm proves to be successful against Wonder Woman, and in the end, she kind of cradles her in her arms and apologizes for attacking her in such a way. But Storm, of course, comes out on top here. And so what we do is we switch to Greenwich Village, and we pick up with Superboy Connor Kent, and we pick up with Ben Reilly. Now, because of the fact that DC versus Marvel was a story that those who wouldn't normally read comics went and got, for people who were getting into the story at the time, there was some explanation on who these characters were. Connor Kent was one in particular, because a lot of fans who weren't reading, comics after the death of Superman, didn't really know who Connor Kent was. They saw him as Superboy, but they didn't know anything beyond that. And so this is what's kind of given to us. Ben Reilly asked the question, who are you? What is it that you're capable of? And, Connor Kent says that he's basically a clone of Superman. He emerged after Superman supposedly died. And, and even then, it kind of takes Ben Reilly by surprise. He's like, really? Yeah, a clone? And it's kind of a funny situation, but again, it's just designed to sort of refresh those of us who wouldn't have known about Connor Kent. And so while the two are going against one another, because of the fact that Ben Reilly has all the same powers as Spider-Man Peter Parker, he's able to easily evade, the attacks of Superboy. Superboy is fast, he's very powerful, but Ben Reilly has the proportional strength of a spider. And so the result is that while the match seems even between the two, what ends up happening here is Ben Reilly basically outwits Connor Kent. He stands in front of an electrical generator, and when Connor Kent comes charging towards him, Ben Reilly jumps out of the way and then covers him in impact webbing thing and allows Superboy to be electrocuted to the point where it basically just knocks him out. And so what we do here is we switch to downtown Metropolis and we pick up with Professor Hulk. Now again, this is the Incredible Hulk with the mind of Bruce Banner, but it costs a portion of his strength. So this is not a full-powered Incredible Hulk. And that's a very important difference to distinguish here, because in this conflict, Metallo, the villain of Superman, is basically wreaking havoc in downtown Metropolis and fighting against the Hulk. And so, what ends up happening is that while the Hulk is, at least seems to be taking on Metallo, Superman makes his appearance known, the two of them team up, they defeat Metallo, but then they're teleported away to, the middle of nowhere, and they start fighting against one another. The battle actually seems extremely even between the two, and the result is that Superman actually comes out on top here. But what he says is that it took everything he had to take the Incredible Hulk down. Now, this is why I say this is so important, because if this had been like Savage Hulk, if this had been the Incredible Hulk from the Onslaught saga, whose mind was removed from the influence of Bruce Banner by Jean Grey, he probably would have taken Superman out. He probably would have taken him out pretty easily, to be quite frank. But because of the fact that this is Professor Hulk, because his strength has been reduced, Superman still had to use everything he had. And so once Professor Hulk is knocked unconscious, Superman basically just lies in wait. And so what we do is we switch back to Manhattan and we pick up with Batman and Captain America. Now, as the two of them are going against one another, Captain America is actually getting really frustrated with Bruce Wayne. And the reason why is because Bruce Wayne is a prodigious fighter when it comes to, hand-to-hand combat, as well as using his surroundings. And in fact, Bruce Wayne's ability to meld into the shadows is really his strong suit here. And this is what happens. Captain America is great when it comes to fighting a foe he can see. He's terrible when it comes to fighting a foe he cannot see. And Bruce Wayne picks that up and begins using it to his advantage. The problem with this is that because the two are so evenly matched, Captain America comes to the conclusion that one, they've been fighting for hours, and two, they would probably end up fighting for days. And so what he says is that their efforts are probably better suited in finding a way to stop the brothers from screwing with reality as opposed to fighting themselves. But in the midst of, this conversation between the two of them, the sewer system is flooded with water. And while Captain America does try to throw his shield to, incapacitate Batman, he ends up missing. But Batman ends up hitting Captain America with one of his batarangs. And so, Steve Rogers is immersed in this water and seems to be drowning. And so while Batman does make it to the top, he swims back down, he grabs Steve Rogers, and he brings it back to the surface. The problem here is that because Steve Rogers was unconscious, even if only for a moment, Batman was basically declared the victor. But what ends up happening is that as they emerge from the sewer system, they're greeted by Access and his mentor. And this is basically where Access provides an explanation. He simply says that he is a character who represents a gateway between these realities. He represents a way for, Batman and Captain America to figure out, gain a better understanding of what's going on with these brothers. But what ends up happening is that while they are in the middle of this conversation, the two brothers join hands with one another, and the two brothers stop existing as individuals and they emerge as a singular entity. And what this did is it allowed Marvel to go forward, allow Marvel and DC to go forward, creating something called the Amalgam Universe. Now, with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and we'll actually pick up with what the Amalgam Universe is, because in the next video, we'll run over it, but I'm not going to go super in-depth into it, just because, the Amalgam Universe was actually pretty huge. There was a lot to it. So as we pick up with part 4 of the DC versus Marvel event, we start out now with a quick explanation on the Amalgam Universe. So because DC versus Marvel was selling like gangbusters when it came out, both companies had the idea to basically create a self-contained universe. And that's what happened at the end of the last video, when the brothers merged with one another and they created the Amalgam Universe. What Marvel and DC did is they went back and they started creating origins, and they treated these characters as if they had existed all along. And so, for example, Darkclaw is, Logan Wayne. It's a combination of Batman and Wolverine. And they provided an origin for his character. They did this with every single Amalgam member. The issue here was that it was, it was weird to say the least. And so almost immediately after this Amalgam universe forms, it gives us the opportunity to sort of go back and to catch up on, these different variations of characters and so on. But the Spectre and the Living Tribunal, both of the, second in command to their respective god, so to speak, in the Marvel and the DC universe, end up merging with one another, and or not really merging, but they end up working with one another, and they commune with Access, and Access uses his shard, or uses his powers, to more or less cleave the amalgam universe in half and set everything back to normal. And so this, or not really back to normal, but set all the characters back to the way they were before. And so instead of having, Spider-Boy, instead of having Ben Reilly and Superboy Connor Kent merged into a singular being, instead of having, Doctor Strange and Dr. Fate merge into a singular being, we instead get them back to their normal selves. And this is really where the story begins to go off the rails. And what I mean by that is, if it wasn't crazy before, it gets crazy now. And it's just one of those instances where Marvel and DC kind of wrote themselves into a hole. With Batman and Captain America and Access working alongside one another in an attempt to bring these brothers down, we're just kind of given like a mishmash of nonsensical things. We have, Superman, and we have the Incredible Hulk, who go against the Maloids and Mole Man. They're basically working together. It's essentially the superheroes trying to deal with their own respective villains and set everything back to rights. But it's also the Living Tribunal, and it's also the Spectre doing what they can as well. But in the end, because the power of these brothers are so extreme, they're basically sort of left without any way to combat the situation. And so the result is Marvel and DC kind of handle it on their own, and they pit, the brothers against one another. The argument here is that because the brothers are so wildly powerful, they're the only ones that can end the conflict. And so once they start fighting each other, in the midst of this battle, they actually look into the pasts of both Captain America and Batman. And when they realize why it was that they became heroes, when they realized that Bruce Wayne became a hero because his parents were murdered, when they realized that Captain America became a hero to save the world from the greatest threat, from the Nazis, the brothers, God, this is thin at best. The brothers are inspired by their reason for becoming heroes and realize that fighting among themselves is pointless, that they're best suited to basically work together. They achieve a kind of inner peace. And so what they end up doing is they effectively just, they shake hands. They congratulate each other on their own achievements, basically saying, yes, the Marvel brother has done some great things and the DC brother has done some great things. They basically call it a day, and everybody goes back to their own respective realities. And in the end, Access just kind of goes back into the unknown. The ending of this is a perfect example of anticlimactic. It is not very good. And this is one of the things that people are so disappointed about when it comes to the Marvel, the DC versus Marvel crossover, is it was a really cool matchup until the end, because it felt like Marvel and DC didn't know how to end the story. They didn't know how to set things back to rights. But one thing I also want to point out here is that in a previous video, something you guys have mentioned, I had said the Infinity Gauntlet would come into play with Thanos and Darkseid. That's actually in the JLA Avengers crossover, which I was so caught up in in our story up to this point that I actually totally forgot about that. So as we continue with our discussions on Marvel versus DC, or at least dipping our toe into the waters of this, what I want to do here is I want to cover the JLA Avengers crossover event. And this is the story where Superman lifts the hammer of Thor and has Captain America's shield, and it looks amazing. But the backstory, or the basis behind the events that lead to the Avengers and the Justice League meeting one another, are basically explained over the course of the series in terms of prologues. And so just for the sake of simple continuity, I'm going to provide the basis behind this entire event up front, and then allow us to just go through the events after that. Now, something I also want to point out here is that this story treats the Marvel vs. DC crossovers as if they never existed. Basically, this is a standalone story where the Marvel vs. DC crossovers of Superman and Spider-Man, Batman, the Incredible Hulk, so on and so forth, where all those led up to the Marvel vs. DC event that we'd previously covered. This is completely standalone, and so you don't need to know anything about the previous Marvel vs. DC events. It's good because you don't need to know anything, but it's also bad because if you're a stickler for continuity, this is going to absolutely throw you for a loop. But getting into the basis behind all this, we initially pick up with a planet called Polemarchus, I think it is, but this planet is not wildly important. What we know is this planet seems to be a combination of technological advancement, but at the same time, it houses a very simple society in terms of their government, in terms of their ruling class. But almost immediately after we're exposed to this society, a set of prying eyes appear in the atmosphere, and the planet is completely and totally annihilated. Now, the reason why this happens, or at least what we're told in terms of the reason why this happens, happens is because Krona has been traveling the multiverse in search of finding the origin of all things. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Krona has a long-running history in DC Comics, explicitly with the Green Lantern Corps, really with the Green Lantern mythos in and of itself. Within DC Comics, Krona was considered to have been the person that led to the creation of the Antimatter universe, to the Anti-Monitor itself, at least. That was before Geoff Johns' Darkseid War. Geoff Johns' Darkseid War changed all that. It really just retconned, all those things. But the fact remains here that, according to the old continuity before Darkseid War, Krona wanted to witness the beginning of all creation, and he did. He used the machine to go back in time and see the beginning of all things. The result was that it basically created evil, it created the Antimatter universe, and it created the Anti-Monitor. And so because of Krona's actions, there was now evil in the universe, which led to the Guardians of the Universe turning around and creating the Manhunters and eventually the Green Lantern Corps. Now, what this story does is it basically makes the case that after his banishment, Krona had taken to, beyond the multiverse in and of itself, into the Omniverse, and began looking at everything, and eventually it led him into the Marvel Universe. Now, upon his arrival in the Marvel Universe, he was met with the Grandmaster. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, who are new to Marvel Comics, because you haven't really seen much of the Grandmaster in All New, All Different Marvel, Grandmaster is a character who, of course, we'll be seeing in Guardians of the Galaxy 2, but he's a guy, one of the elders of the universe. That is to say, he's one of the oldest people in the universe, and his claim to fame is games. What he really likes to do is play games out of whatever he can. Games that test the mind, games that test the physical body. If he can turn a situation into a game that can be played, then he will do that. And so when Krona basically appears, in this universe, and Grandmaster recognizes him, or at least is drawn to his attention, Krona immediately says that his goal here is to learn the secrets of all creation. And while Grandmaster initially refuses to offer him the way to find the creation of all things, instead he says, we'll make a game out of it. And so what happens is the two of them go about effectively, or at least the Grandmaster goes about effectively turning this entire situation on providing Krona with the answers to the creation of all things into a game that involves both the Justice League and the Avengers. Now, what this does is allow us to actually pick up with this event. And what we learn is that initially picking up with the Justice League, that their existence, their universe is much like we would expect it to be. And this is really just Kurt Busiek showing us how things exist in this reality. In the DC universe, the Justice League are fighting giant monsters, fighting some giant machine. But what's interesting about this is that this is not something that they're used to. They don't recognize it as a kind of villain they would normally fight. And the reason why is because they're warned by the Spectre, Hal Jordan, that there are various villains or various characters from other universes, from the Marvel Universe, that are crossing over into their reality. Now, to sidetrack here for a second, for those of you guys who are not familiar with the whole Hal Jordan Spectre element, what happened was when Hal Jordan was basically removed from the DC landscape during Emerald Twilight, the issue was that DC still wanted to bring him back if they wanted to use him. And so what they did is they rolled him over into being the hand of vengeance of God, being the Spectre. And it was basically just a way to keep him on the back burner, for them to bring him back like Geoff Johns did with Green Lantern Rebirth if they ever decided to use him again in the future, which of course we know is something they chose to do. But with the Spectre appearing here, what he basically says is that all these different individuals crossing over come from another universe, although he doesn't explicitly tell the Justice League what this is. In addition to this, we switch over to the Marvel Universe in New York City, and we pick up with the Avengers facing off against a villain named Starro. Now, in truth, this is really just Kurt Busiek, hailing back to the original Justice League story. And what I mean here is that when the Justice League first appeared in DC Comics, they literally went against a villain named Starro. It was a giant starfish, and it had the ability to create smaller starfish that would take over the minds of whoever those starfish attacked. And that's what happens here. These little starfish are taking over the minds of, all these different superheroes and so on. But the Vision, being an android, being able to analyze situations using his cybernetic components, comes to the realization that these small little starfish all basically share a hive mind with a larger starfish controlling them, with Starro determining what it is they can and can't do. And so what he does is he comes to the realization that if they effectively overload these starfish, they can in turn overload Starro and send him running. And that's exactly what happens. They allow one of these starfish to be attached to the mind of Wanda Maximoff, and in response, she sends out a backlash of psychic energy that sends Starro just running for the hills due to the fact that the energy is so extreme, really more so than Starro can handle. And so what happens is the Avengers travel back to Avengers Mansion, and they get word from the character Quasar, from Wendell Vaughn. Now, Quasar is kind of a weird situation in the realm of Marvel, right? You know, he's this guy that basically just exists to try to protect the universe, but he's one of a multitude of people that play this different role. You know, of course, we know that Nova and the Nova Corps exist to protect the universe. We know that, you know, to a degree, Captain Universe does the same thing, but Captain Universe only manifests in times of extreme need. So Wendell Vaughn and his quantum bands are basically kind of the protector here, but the fact remains that Wendell Vaughn also monitors everything in the universe. And what he says is that there are various entities crossing over from other realities, and their actions or why this is happening doesn't seem to make sense. Now, we know that these are DC characters, that Lobo basically just shows up in the Shi'ar Empire and immediately starts wreaking havoc. That all these things are rooted in the idea of the DC universe crossing over with the Marvel universe, and the Marvel universe crossing over with the DC universe. Now again, these superheroes don't know this. All they know is that unrecognized characters are crossing over from other realities, and they're trying to figure out why. Now from here, we transition over to Wally West, because again, this point in the Flash's publication history is after the death of Barry Allen during Crisis on Infinite Earths, with Wally West taking over his role as the Flash. Now, with Wally West running on a mission, you know, for the Justice League, as he's trying to communicate with him, he suddenly crosses the dimensional barriers. Now, what he's done is he's crossed the dimensional barriers into the Marvel universe, and he picks up with a mutant that's being run off by various humans. Now, this is a huge shock for Wally West, and the reason why is because people aren't usually shunned for their physical appearance in the DC universe. The only real exception to that I can think of off the top of my head is like Doom Patrol or something like that. But for the most part, there doesn't really seem to be an analog in the DC universe to the Warlocks of the Marvel universe. I could be wrong about this, and if I am, feel free to correct me down in the description, but I feel fairly certain that that's the case. But the fact remains here that because this particular mutant is being set upon by these humans in such an extreme degree, that Wally West's idea is to get him out of there. The problem with this is that because Wally West is not in the DC universe, he can't access his Speed Force in the same capacity. Now, this is something that's really important here, because what Kurt Busiek says is that whenever it is, or at least what he establishes in this point, is that whenever a speedster leaves their universe, their connection to the Speed Force or their ability to use their speed just doesn't suddenly stop. It's not gone all of a sudden. Instead, the Speed Force is much like a battery in the sense that it routinely keeps them charged. But when that connection goes away, just like a battery that's being used, the charge will begin to dissipate. And that's what happens with Wally West. The charge of the Speed Force begins to go away. And the problem is that while he does try to make his way back, he is successfully able to do so with the help of the Justice League, who effectively seem to teleport him there. Now, we're not given a real explanation as to how. All we know is that he's simply just there. This is one of the issues that comes into play when it involves the Avengers versus Justice League crossover event, in the sense that, you know, we're basically told that the Justice League saw that there was a dimensional rift, they saw Wally West was in it, and they pulled him out, and that's it. We're not really given any explanation as to why. But the fact remains here that, you know, for Wally West, you know, while he is trying to explain to the Justice League what it is that had happened, suddenly the Watcher appears. Now, we could go into a huge explanation about the Watcher. The good thing about this is that we don't have to. Instead, Kurt Busiek immediately introduces the Grandmaster to the Justice League, and the Grandmaster explains who the Watcher is. And what he tells them is that the Watcher just watches things. The Watcher's immensely powerful, that he could probably wipe out the Justice League if he chose to, but the fact remains that the Watcher doesn't act. The Watcher just chronicles events that take place, and that's it. That's really all he does. Not only that, because the Grandmaster was able to make his way into the JLA Watchtower, the Justice League is almost immediately skeptical of his appearance. They don't know who he is, they don't know why he's here, and while John Jones can't seem to read his mind, Kyle Rayner, the Green Lantern, is able to use his lantern ring to create a box that the Grandmaster can't get out of. And so while they initially begin to question him, the Grandmaster's kind of hesitant here. He likes to play games, he sort of messes around with him, and so Wonder Woman uses her lasso of truth. And this is another cool concept. This is another really cool idea, because what Kurt Busiek says is that the lasso of truth does not seem to be bound by dimensional barriers. The lasso of truth works regardless of who's ensnared inside of it, whether they're from the native reality that Wonder Woman happens to be in, or a different reality. It's all the same thing. But what Grandmaster says is that the barriers between the Marvel and DC universe have effectively become weakened. And because of that, there are 12 items, 6 items from Marvel and 6 from DC that have crossed over into the other reality. And so 6 items from from the Marvel Universe have crossed over into the DC Universe, and 6 items from the DC Universe have crossed over into the Marvel Universe. And so what Grandmaster says is that these items that belong to the Justice League, the bell, the wheel, and the jar, Medusa's mask, the Spear of Destiny, the Green Lantern power battery, and so on, are currently in the Marvel Universe, and the Justice League has to go and retrieve them. Now, the reason why Kurt Busiek did this is because the most powerful artifacts are these 6 artifacts. Now, in DC Comics, the bell, the wheel, and the jar belong to these 3 brothers of sorts who ruled the universe for something like 3 billion years, and they were wildly powerful, but they were eventually banished out. However, whoever it is that is able to attain the bell, the wheel, and the jar can summon these 3 brothers back and use them to do their bidding. At the same time, the Green Lantern power battery allows the wielder of a Green Lantern ring to harness those energies for a multitude of different effects. Now, while this does not mean that a person can just pick up a Green Lantern ring and use this, what it does mean is that within the DC Universe, the Green Lantern power battery is one of the most powerful artifacts in existence. Now, something to keep in mind is this is long before the arrival of, the Red Lantern Corps and the Sinestro Corps and all those different corps. At this point in DC's continuity, you have Sinestro with a yellow lantern ring, and then you just have the Green Lanterns. There's nothing else going on here. And so what happens is Grandmaster says, in order to solidify, in order to fix this problem, you have to travel to the Marvel Universe, you have to attain those items, and you have to bring them back. The issue with this is that Wally West recognizes that his Speed Force doesn't work in the Marvel Universe. And so because of this, he elects to stay behind. In response, the Atom, Ray Palmer, takes his place and travels with the Justice League. Now, what Wally West does is he moves at such a rapid pace that he allows the Justice League to basically vibrate through these dimensional barriers, and they land in the Marvel Universe. Now, while this happens, they basically land on the moon, and the Avengers pick up what it is that's going on. And so what the Avengers do is they travel to the moon to investigate the source of this energy signature they don't recognize. But while they're traveling there, the Justice League is being brought to Earth under the protection of Kyle Rayner. Not only that, because of the fact that Martian Manhunter has telepathy, because of the fact that they don't really know much about the planet that they're dealing with, they ultimately have Martian Manhunter use his telepathy to bind them all mentally so they can basically read each other's thoughts and know everything that's going on. Now, when they initially arrive in the Marvel Universe, they end up in an island off the sea of Akatosk, I think it is. Akatsk, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, which is it's a real location. But the fact remains here that when they arrive, they're met by all manner of beasts and monsters and different things like that. And for the Justice League, this isn't a real problem. The Justice League are easily able to take these monsters out. But the reason why they've arrived in this location is because within this area lies the Ultimate Nullifier. Now, the Ultimate Nullifier is something that the Justice League is not aware of, but John Jones begins to analyze it and comes to the realization that the Ultimate Nullifier allows its wielder to wipe out anything in existence up to and including the entirety of the universe. And so for them, this is an insanely powerful artifact, and its power is actually overwhelming. However, almost immediately after they lay their hands on it, Hawkeye of the Avengers shoots an arrow and takes the Ultimate Nullifier away. However, Wonder Woman's able to move fast enough to capture the arrow, after which the Justice League initially move in on the Avengers, but then the Avengers suddenly teleport away. And so what happens is that while the Avengers are trying to figure out what's going on, while they basically take off with the Ultimate Nullifier, they're suddenly met by the arrival of Metron. Now, in the DC universe, those of you guys who don't know, Metron is akin to the Watcher, but instead of, all the knowledge that he witnesses, or all the events that he witnesses being stored in his eyes like they are with the Watcher in the Marvel Universe, instead, it's all stored in his chair. But Metron has basically seen the collapse and rebirth of universes, and he's seen all these events take place, and so he's essentially the keeper of all knowledge in the DC universe, and he appears to the Avengers and says the exact same thing, or doesn't really say the exact same thing, but he basically makes the case to the Avengers regarding what the Justice League are, what they're about. And what he says is, much like the Grandmaster, that 6 of their most powerful artifacts have been transported to the DC universe, the Infinity Stones, the Casket of Ancient Winters, that these are artifacts that they have to retrieve in order to preserve their universe. Now, the difference is that instead of telling the Avengers that the dimensional barriers have been weakened and that retrieving these artifacts will restore the dimensional barriers, instead, Metron offers a different story from what Grandmaster said and tells the Avengers that if they do not retrieve these artifacts, that their universe will be destroyed. Now, the reason why this matters is because Ray Palmer, as the Atom, had basically hitched a ride on Metron's chair and had overheard the entirety of the situation, that Metron seems to be telling a different story from the Grandmaster. And the result of this is that Adam is trying to figure out exactly what's going on, why two different stories are being told to two different people. And so what happens is the Avengers are effectively given a boom tube, and the Avengers travel back to the DC universe alongside with the Justice League themselves, who have already arrived. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because when the Justice League was originally in the Marvel universe, they were disappointed by the fact that the Earth in the Marvel universe was absolutely devastated, that, for the most part, the superheroes had done nothing to make the Earth better. But when the Avengers arrive in the Justice League universe, in the DC universe, they realize that humanity idolizes their superheroes, that the Justice League is kind of considered the savior of their own planet. And so because of this, when the Avengers' presence is detected by the Justice League, the two of them basically engage in a massive battle. Now again, this is really just a scenario whereby Kurt Busiek is giving us what we want to see. We just love to see the Avengers fight. We love to see the Avengers take on the Justice League. It was really the question of which team is better than the other. But unlike Marvel versus DC, where this is going to focus on just the two teams fighting one another, instead, this is going to cover the entirety of the Marvel and the DC universes and almost every single hero and villain they've ever faced. Now, picking up with Captain America and Batman, this is where things begin to shift. And the reason why is it's long been argued who would win, Batman versus Captain America. Some people say that Captain America would always win whether or not Batman had prep time. Some people will say that Batman would always win, regardless of whether or not he had prep time. And others say that it would be a draw. Kurt Busiek takes the stance of it being a draw. He has basically Captain America and Batman make the case that if the two of them continue to fight, it would be a draw, and there would be no end to it because they're so equally matched in terms of their capabilities. Not only that, Batman comes to the realization that the two of them simply just seems to be pawns in this game, in addition to the Justice League themselves and the Avengers. And so the idea is for the two of them to work together and try to figure things out on their own. Now, the reason why Captain America and Batman do this separately is because a two-man team investigating the basis behind this entire series of events will draw less attention than the entirety of the Avengers and the Justice League working together. And so what happens is that over the course of this conflict, so to speak, we learn that whenever it is that these artifacts are located and attained, that they're whisked away. And what happens is it's more or less a scenario where the Grandmaster and Krona are keeping score. If the Avengers locate one of their artifacts, then the score is 1 for the Avengers, 0 for the Justice League. But if a member of the Justice League and a member of the Avengers both locate one of their artifacts, it's 1-1, if that makes any sense. And so the idea is that whoever it is that discovers all of their artifacts first effectively wins. And so that would basically lend the situation to either Krona or Grandmaster, which we'll see that come to fruition at the end of the story. But the fact remains that for the conflict in and of itself, we basically have the Avengers and the Justice League just fighting it out with each other as best they can. We have Wonder Woman taking on Hercules, we have Superman taking on Carol Danvers. You have all these superheroes basically fighting one another from each of their realities. And in truth, this is really just a comic book fan's best scenario, is the best way I can put it. Not only that, it's actually Aquaman that discovers the Cask of Ancient Winters. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the Cask of Ancient Winters is an artifact that belongs to the Frost Giants. For those of you guys who are coming from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that giant blue box that was glowing and that seemed to be completely frozen in the Thor movies, that's the Cask of Ancient Winters. And what happens is if somebody opens it, it basically spills out the infinite cold of Jotunheim that could spread across, realities in themselves and essentially freeze everything over. But the fact remains here that each time one of these artifacts is discovered, the artifacts are whisked away by Krona or by Grandmaster, and each of their side is awarded a point. And so ultimately we transition again back to Captain America and Batman as the two of them begin to go through all this discussion, all this evidence that they've collected basically regarding the conflicts of these various heroes and the various, from various sides. And ultimately they come to the realization that again, this game is being set up, that someone is pulling the strings, having both of these teams fight one another, not because the artifacts need to be captured, but for simple sport, simply because it seems to be entertaining. And so the result of this is that their efforts ultimately lead them to the location of Grandmaster and Krona. And what happens when they come across this location is they realize that Grandmaster and Krona had put them against one another, that the situation, again, as we've already discussed, led to the idea that whichever side wins will determine the fate of all things. If Krona wins, then Krona will be able to summon Galactus Galactus and essentially learn all the secrets of Galactus, and God only knows what he would do after that. But if Grandmaster wins, then Krona will basically lose access to Galactus and will have to go about his way. In addition to this, and this is something that's actually been a big source of contention, is the Infinity Gauntlet. That's really the big question that a lot of people have, that I imagine a lot of you guys have. What happens with the Infinity Gauntlet? Now, this is not the first time that we've received an answer to this question, but this is the first time it's officially been addressed. There have been other times where it's been alluded to. There have been other times where different people have made the case about it, but JLA and Avengers is the first time it was solidified in stone by Marvel regarding the Infinity Gauntlet. What happens here is that on the planet of Apocalypse, which of course, you know, as we know resides, or I guess is under the control of Darkseid, the Infinity Gauntlet falls into his grasp. And our first thought is, oh my God, Darkseid has the Infinity Gauntlet, he's going to wreak havoc on everything. The problem with this is that the Infinity Gauntlet only works in the reality that it hails from, meaning that the Infinity Gauntlet of Earth 616 only works in the Earth 616 reality. The Infinity Gauntlet of Earth, you know, RobCorp only works in the RobCorp reality. And so because of the fact that the Infinity Gauntlet has been sent to the DC universe, means it's basically powerless, that it can't be used for anything. Now, this is also kind of a weird situation because we would expect something that can manipulate reality to work in any reality, but it basically offers a caveat to an otherwise trump card within the Marvel Comics. But what we end up doing is we end up following the Justice League and the Avengers to the final artifact. And the final artifact is the Cosmic Cube, which resides inside the Savage Land. And what this does is this leads to one massive battle between those superheroes who still exist here, but we also see some really, really cool moments. For example, Thor versus Superman. Now, the reason why this is so cool is because the idea has always been assumed that if a person cannot wield the hammer of Thor, then they cannot withstand the hammer of Thor. Now, there's only been one instance that I know of where this has been rebuked, and that was when Thor threw his hammer at Juggernaut and nothing happened. With Superman, this seems to be the exact same way. Thor uses his hammer and tries to attack Superman with it, and Superman holds the hammer back. Now, this also raises a really interesting question regarding its hammer and its relation to Thor. For example, if Thor were holding his hammer, could you lift Thor off the ground? Like, it's just weird questions like that exist that kind of beg the question of, is it possible? You know, would you effectively be lifting the hammer by virtue of lifting Thor, and would the worthiness clause come into play? So while your brains are hopefully exploding based on that question, we ultimately see that Superman actually topples Thor. And so again, we have the rest of the Avengers and the Justice League continuing their fight against one another. Now, as this battle continues to commence, the Cosmic Cube ultimately falls in the hands of Quicksilver, who races to grab it before anybody else can, even before Wally West himself. And so what happens is both Krona and Grandmaster appear here, and Grandmaster makes the case that the artifact has fallen in the hands of Quicksilver, thereby creating a stalemate, meaning that each side has effectively captured its own artifact. But in the midst of all this, Captain America throws his shield, knocks the Cosmic Cube out of the hand of Quicksilver, which lands in the hands of Batman, meaning that Grandmaster has won this conflict. But because of this, Krona is not satisfied with the outcome, and instead he attacks the Avengers. And so when he ultimately summons Galactus, he basically says, you know, I want to know the secrets of all things. I want to know the secrets of all creation. Now, Galactus initially says no, but because of the power that he possesses, Krona seems to be able to overpower Galactus. Now, while all the forces of the Avengers and the Justice League seem to concentrate their efforts on defeating Krona, we ultimately learn that the entire game was a ruse by Grandmaster for the purpose of allowing him to converge all the artifacts into himself, and in turn, essentially, or at least it seems, to recreate reality. And so what happens is everything reemerges, everything seems to convene back into itself, into a singular universe, and what Kurt Busiek does is he presents us with a scenario where the Avengers and the Justice League have been friends for years. It's almost like an amalgamation of these two universes combined. For example, Dr. Doom had tried to access the Source, and because of this, he had become merged with the Source Wall. We're not told what events led up to this, we're simply told that this is the case. And the result is that the Justice League and the Avengers celebrate with one another over their victory. They basically party, they enjoy, everything that's going on, and they have no reason to question each other. In addition to this, they routinely travel from one world to the other. The Avengers travel to the DC universe, the DC universe travels to the Avengers universe, and they basically help each other out within, solving their various problems. The issue with this is that in the midst of this conflict, Krona seems to make his presence known. And because of this, memories begin to flood back to the Avengers and the Justice League regarding their previous lives. Now, these are not full-on memories. They're simply just fractions of their memories. They're getting glimpses, more or less, into the way their life used to be. But this is really just Kurt Busiek giving us an out. This is Kurt Busiek basically saying that small things are coming back here and there. In addition to this, because of the actions of Krona with regards to his merging these realities into a single continuity, it's essentially unraveling the fabric of all existence. And so the reality itself starts bouncing in and out of a corporeal form, and it begins to sort of break down at the seams, and things begin to jump back and forth, and things begin to shift back and forth. And so ultimately, once the Avengers and the Justice League begin to come to, once they begin to realize how things are supposed to be versus how things actually are, they more or less begin to band together. But something else to take note of here is it's not really until the characters of Hal Jordan and Barry Allen suddenly re-emerge that a full-blown effort is actually involved here. And the reason why is these various characters, these various members of the teams are shown what their actual worlds look like by Grandmaster, which is to say he basically gives them perspective. He shows the Justice League the sacrifices of the DC universe, that Hal Jordan went crazy and became a bad guy. He shows the Avengers the life of Barry Allen when he sacrificed his life in order to preserve the multiverse during Crisis on Infinite Earths. Likewise, he shows the Justice League the fact that Vision and Scarlet Witch had kids, and those kids turned out to have been the shards of Mephisto. He shows each team the sacrifices the other team made. The issue with this is that a lot of these heroes don't want to see things go back to the way they were. Instead, they live in this idyllic reality. They live in this perfect reality, and they don't want to see things shift. But by virtue of Hal Jordan, who has, again, without any real explanation, returned to his previous form before Emerald Twilight when he went insane, because he speaks to the team and he basically says, hey guys, look, our worlds weren't perfect, but they were our worlds, and we should keep them as our worlds. The teams ultimately join forces under the idea of going forward and attacking Krona in an effort to set things back to rights. Now, from here, Kurt Busiek actually wraps things up pretty fast. He makes quick work of the story in the sense that I would imagine at this point, it seemed as though he was basically writing himself into a hole. And what I mean here is that situations like this could go on forever, in the sense that the Avengers and the Justice League could basically team up, or they could fight. These scenarios could unfold for God only knows how long. But because of the fact that Barry Allen's here, because of the fact that Hal Jordan's here, because things simply aren't right, the idea is to basically fix all this and give us an end to this story. And so what happens is that under the direction of Captain America, they ultimately lead their forces to the remains of Galactus, which Krona has formed into his own stronghold. In addition to this, Krona has basically taken all these different forms of energy and combined them into a single source that he can then turn around and use and converge all things into a single Big Bang, basically condense it down into a singularity, witness the destruction of the multiverse, the rebirth of a new universe, and see how everything came into existence in the first place. And so what happens is that while all these heroes attempt to defeat Krona, this sort of convergence of all their villains begins to take place, in the sense that every single villain that's ever existed in the publication history of the Avengers and the Justice League begins to emerge and begins to fight against these heroes. And so basically it's more or less Krona creating a situation where it's a stalemate, where as long as the heroes are distracted by the villains that they've faced, then ultimately it'll give them a chance, or it'll give him a chance to continue the process of converging all these different universes down into a singularity, leading to the destruction of all things and the rebirth of a new universe. And so what happens is, because Superman is really the core of the superhero element, right? Because he's so capable, because he's so strong and powerful, he's able to hold his own against the various villains that he's going against. The problem with this is that characters like Molecule Man are still extremely powerful, because remember, this is after the first Secret Wars event. And so Molecule Man has the ability to warp reality. Not only that, Superman is sort of the symbol of superheroes. And so while he is able to lead his forces against, all these different villains, in the end, it just doesn't quite seem to be enough. And so what happens, and this is actually a really, really cool moment, what happens is that while Thor is momentarily defeated, or seems to be defeated, while all hope seems to be lost in the sense that the superheroes are being wildly overpowered, Thor throws his hammer to Superman, and Superman catches it while simultaneously wielding the shield of Captain America, which is beastly. It's absolutely amazing. And so what this does is it allows him to use the hammer to penetrate the citadel of Krona, giving them a way in and past the villains, as well as allowing Superman to start laying waste to the villains using the hammer. Now again, this is only a temporary moment. That is to say, the Superman won't be able to wield it again, and we'll actually find out why at the end of this story. But the fact remains here that with this portal open, Barry Allen and Hawkeye effectively work together in the sense that Barry Allen sort of relives this instance where he died against the Anti-Monitor, where he begins running around in circles as a distraction for Krona. And when Krona turns his gaze away for the slightest second, the result is that Hawkeye shoots an arrow laced with TNT into the device that Krona is using to converge all these realities and destroys it, thereby allowing all these different universes to begin breaking away. In addition to this, this also forces Hal Jordan to return to his Spectre form, and he again also assists, and I guess operating as the hand of God in terms of pushing these worlds apart and keeping them from merging into one another. And so in the fallout of all this, once everything seems to be going back to normal, we pick up with Superman trying to figure out why he couldn't lift the hammer of Thor again. And what Thor says is that Odin was watching, or at least he seems to hint at it, that Odin was watching the events unfold and granted Superman a momentary instance of being able to lift the hammer. Now again, this is really just Kurt Busiek giving us a reason why he could lift it. It doesn't seem that Superman is actually worthy, or if he was worthy, it was only for a moment. The fact is he's simply not worthy of wielding it anytime he wants to. And so what this does is this again wraps up extremely fast. This is really Kurt Busiek just telling us that the tale more or less comes to an end, that these superheroes recognize the value of each other, but we also have an instance whereby they came together, fought off an incredible foe, and then the events are just kind of left open with Metron and Grandmaster more or less making the case that if it should all happen again, that the teams will come together again and they'll fight off whatever foe they happen to go against, just like they did this time around. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end, and yeah, it was kind of interesting. This is a really interesting situation, simply because of the fact that Krona was kind of absorbed down into this cosmic egg, and he would give birth to a new universe, allowing him to witness, all of creation. But it was really just sort of Kurt Busiek trying to wrap up a story where he seemed to write himself into a hole. But it wasn't bad. I mean, it wasn't the worst thing ever. It was actually kind of fun to just see the Avengers and the Justice League fight one another. But if you guys are interested in seeing more Marvel vs. DC content, make sure you guys drop a like, make sure you guys leave me a comment, and also if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, feel free to hit the sub button and become part of the Rob Corps. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace. I want to give a shout out to Jason C, Austin S, Jason S, Austin H, Philip, and Austin B. We have a lot of Austins in our Patreon, as well as Genosis916. Genosis didn't give us a first and last name, so we kind of had to roll with it. I didn't mention your all's last names. I figured you guys didn't want me to throw them out there, but I want to say thank you to you all. By the way, your Rob Corps rings should be on their way. For our Honor Guard members of the Rob Corps, for these special patrons, your custom Rob Corps rings should be on their way. They're being shipped to me. After that, I will have them shipped to you. Stay tuned, keep your eye on Patreon and your messages, and you will hear about them coming to you. Thank you.